Hey, welcome back to EDH on a Budget. I'm your host, Iceman, and today we're going to be going over 5 ways to not get flooded with lands or hosed with your lands. And that's some of the biggest problems for new players starting off, and I struggled with this for a while until I discovered these 5 ways to improve my deck building. First up, we have cycling lands. Cycling lands like Secluded Steep and Irrigated Farmland are great because when you have too many lands in your hand, you can easily cycle this out on turn 1 or turn 2 for irrigated farmland, because if you have 4 or 5 lands in your opening hand, that seems like a lot, but with the cycling land, it gives you something to do on turn 1 and lets you dig through your deck. Next up, we have Faithless Looting, for example. I'm using Faithless Looting as a way to represent many cards. Um, Oh yeah, Secluded Steep and Irrigated Farmland are both 10 cents. Faithless Looting is about 16 cents. It's been printed dozens of times. It's so many reprints. All right, so this Faithless Looting, what it does is it lets you dig deep. It's not necessarily card advantage because you don't really go up on cards. You draw 2 and you discard 2 for 1 red mana, and as flashback for 2 in a red, we do the same thing. So technically, if anything, your hand size goes down by 1 card by playing this card. But what it does is if you only have 2 lands and you haven't hit that third land, this lets you again dig deeper looking for that land if you don't have it. And even if you have way too many lands starting off, if this card is in your hand, it might be worth keeping that hand just because you can pitch 2 of those lands and you'll probably get at least 1 non-land card. Um, but in general, cheap card draw, cheap rummaging, cheap looting. By cheap, I'm talking about mana value. You want to be able to do this on turns 1 and 2 if you're mana flooded. Alright, having a 5 mana, 6 mana wheel or draw 6 cards is not going to help you if you only got 2 lands. So while some of those big card draw are great, you do not want the bulk of your deck to be that, because your opening hands will be more rigid, and you won't be able to keep so many cards that way. Next up, and this is my favorite way, add more modal cards. Modal has been around for a little while, but for example, I'm going to use Tangled Florahedron. It is about 15 cents, and it's a tapped land that taps for a green on the back side, and the front side is a mana dork that taps for a green. So there's really no bad hand for this as long as if you got 2 lands. Okay, maybe I play this as a tap land on turn 1 just so I'm sure to hit my third land drop. If I have too many lands, say I have 5 lands in my opening hand, I play this on turn 2 as a mana dork instead, whereas a basic land or even a dual land or fetch land can't do that. So this does open up more options, and this is just an example. They just reprinted a bunch of modal spells, and I'm going to have a separate video for that for my favorite picks. I'm really excited about them, and I definitely need to order a lot of them because they're just so much better. The original modal set cycle had probably 2 or 3 really good ones, and then like 3 to 5 that are like, depending on the deck, it could go in, and then some that were just really not that great. So with this new modal cycle printed, you really have plenty of options, and I see no reason you would not play these lands. So we'll go into that in a different video. Next up, we have Simic Growth Chamber. This is representing all the bounce lands. Some people don't like bounce lands, but there's a lot of utility in this. As I just discussed, with the modal, you might be playing it for a land, and a bounce land going into play, you can bounce that modal spell up, and then you got that spell to use later in the game. It's also, in a way, kind of like an extra land in your hand. So if you only have 2 lands in your opening hand, and one of them is Simic Growth Chamber, you might be able to keep it because you play a land on turn 1, you play the Simic Growth Chamber on turn 2, you bounce that land to your hand, and then you play that land on turn 3. You've played 3 lands with only 2 lands, if that makes sense to you. So it's like a card draw built in as a land that you only draw a land, basically. I also like to use this with other utility ETB lands. There's quite a few. I think my favorite's probably Island Sanctuary. It's a blue land that enters the battlefield, and if you have 3 or more islands, which it is an island, then you get to return a instant or sorcery to the top of your deck, I believe, and that is just great recursion. There's other ones that'll create tokens and do lots of stuff, but bottom line is bounce lands are great in many decks. I will play some cards that untap lands, and when you have a bounce land to untap, that's extra value, and it can really feel like those spells start that untap lands, it feels like you're casting them for free. And leaving 1 land untapped is sometimes nice when it's got 2 colors on it. All of the bounce lands except for 1 are dual colored, so they help fix your colors too. And last but not least is running the right amount of lands, especially to the curve of your deck. So the faster, closer to CEDH decks, they have such a low mana curve with 0 mana ramp, 1 mana ramp, and all their spells are free or 1. You don't really need a lot of lands in those decks, so this isn't going to be for them. But most decks, I feel, should be playing about 36 to 38 lands, and that's going to depend on if you're like in landfall. You're going to want more, because you always want to hit your landfall, because that's what your deck needs to do. It's not going to do anything without landfalls triggering, so you might need 40 or 44 depending on those decks. And when I say 36 to 38, that's typically what I put in before I start counting those modal spells. And I don't count bounce spells as extra, bounce lands as extra lands. That's just extra value during playing. But the modal spells that are lands on the back, those are above the 36 or 38. Because if I'm counting it as my land, as one of the 36, then more often than not, I'm playing that tap land, and I don't want to necessarily be depending on the tap land. I want it as like an emergency, because playing a tap land is better than playing no land. I can assure you of that. And as far as playing less lands, again, faster curves don't need as much. You could possibly get away if you had some real cheap commanders that draw cards. I think Sithis is a common example. It's only 2 mana, and it's an enchantress that draws cards every time you play an enchantment. Well, that deck is filled with 1-drop enchantments. The commander comes out on turn 2, so you're probably playing at least 2 or 3 1-drop enchantments on turn 3. You're going to hit your lands. And the rule that I keep in my head is that in a 99 card deck, if you have 33 lands, that means 1 out of every 3 cards, roughly, is going to be a land. Because of variance naturally happens in the game, you might go 4 or 5 cards without drawing a land, or you might hit 2 or 3 in a row. But bottom line, if you start going under 33, you're not going to be seeing that land as often. And when I have my opening hand, I look at it and I think how many lands are in my deck, and I keep that number in my mind. 1 out of 3 is what the land count is in my deck if I only have 33. So keeping a 2-land hand with 33 cards in the deck is very risky, because statistically, should you hit it? Yeah. Are you going to hit it every time? No. And those games are not going to be fun, not hitting your 3rd land drop. So just keep that in mind. Not everybody likes math, but there's a lot of math in this game. So thanks for watching. Hope you liked it. Hit the like, share, and subscribe. I appreciate it. Bye.